Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. It's your host again, Michael Shermer. This episode is brought to you by Wondrium. You know Wondrium. I talk about them all the time. Love the company, formerly the teaching company. The great courses you know them as. Now it's a series of college-level audio and video courses and documentaries, tutorials, short-form videos, how-to lessons, travel logs, and all kinds of great content. So you get it through a subscription service, app on your phone or your laptop. And you just click in and you're off and running. I mean, just hundreds and hundreds of courses, each of which have a dozen to 24 30-minute lectures. Here's one as an example that is definitely going to the top of my list. Extreme Offenders, Psychological Insights. All right, check it out. Here we go. There are 12 30-minute lectures in this one. Rage and the Serial Killer, Cruelty and Lust Murder, Killing Husbands for Gain. Yeah, that doesn't sound good. A Life for a Life, Deceptions of a Fatal Chameleon, Ted Bundy. Each of these lectures titles I'm reading is affiliated with a particular individual, one of these serial killers. They're advertising this is in time for Halloween. That's funny, because it is pretty spooky. So anyway, check it out. This is just one of hundreds of examples that are available at Wondrium. And if you sign up through my show, you get 50% off the first 3 months. That's half off that first quarter on your subscription. Go to wondrium.com/Shermer, WONDRIUM.com/ you know the name, SHERMER, Shermer. Wondrium.com/Shermer. Get the 50% off that first quarter. Check it out. This episode is brought to you by Wren, W-R-E-N. Wren. What is Wren? Wren is a startup that's making it easy for everyone to make a meaningful difference in the climate crisis. I mean, most of us feel like, what can I do, right? You can join Wren, and when you do, they plant trees. Their goal is to unlock the collective action of millions of individuals to drive the kind of change needed to end the climate crisis. And they do so by getting you to lower your carbon footprint. They'll actually do the calculation for you. I've done it. It's pretty cool. How much carbon do you use? What is your footprint? Then, based on your lifestyle, of course, everybody varies. And then they'll offset that by planting trees, which ultimately protects the rainforest. It sequesters CO2 gases and so on. So when you sign up through this show, they will plant 10 extra trees in your name. So here's how you do it. You go to wren.co/Shermer. That's WREN.co/Shermer, SHERMER. Check it out. wren.co/Shermer. Just give them your name. It's free to sign up, and then you can upgrade from there for different programs that they have. But right off the bat, 10 trees in your name. I already did that, and that was pretty cool. And, you know, collectively, of course, that makes a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of difference when I get 10 trees planted in my name. But if enough of us do it, it starts to make a difference, right? So this is a collective action problem, as they call it in economics. You know, no one of us can make a difference, but together, if we have enough of us working on it, we can make a difference. So that's what Wren is all about. I'm happy to have them, honored to have them as a supporter, sponsor of our show. And so I hope you do too. WREN.co/Shermer. Check it out. All right, here's our episode. My guest today is Justin Gregg. He's a senior research associate with the Dolphin Communication Project and an adjunct professor at St. Francis Xavier University, where he lectures on animal behavior and cognition. Originally from Vermont, Justin studied the echolocation abilities of wild dolphins in Japan and the Bahamas. He currently lives in rural Nova Scotia, where he writes about science and contemplates the inner lives of the crows that live near his home. Okay, welcome. Justin, nice to see you. Here's the new book, If Nietzsche Were a Narwhal, subtitled What Animal Intelligence Reveals About Human Stupidity. It's a great and descriptive subtitle. We usually talk about human intelligence on this show, but rarely about human stupidity. Well, maybe irrationality we cover a lot. But before we get into that, Justin, I'd love to know a little bit about your previous book, which I haven't read yet, but I'm going to, on dolphins. And I bring this up because I was going through my archives recently. I just moved my office. And this was given to me by the professor who taught ethology when I took a course in ethology in graduate school. Margaret Fitch, she was named then she became Margaret White. Anyway, this is John C. Lilly, the classic, right? Man and Dolphins in 1961 language, right? Man and Dolphins.
Yeah.
So, he's got pictures in here of the huge dolphin brain. It is pretty amazing when you see this brain. I mean, here it is, this gigantic, huge thing, right? And I guess the argument is that it per body mass, weight, or length, or whatever, it's bigger than humans. Anyway, so I just wanted to kind of get a sense of, since 1961 is the last time I read anything about this, which for me was in the 70s. What do we know about dolphin intelligence and personality and all that?
Well, John Lilly's an interesting story because it was really just the size of the brain that got him so excited. The first time he was a physician, and the first time he saw a dolphin brain, it was huge. And so he's like, wow, based on the size of that, they must be pretty smart. And so he really kicked off this interest in dolphins as being super intelligent and also possibly capable of language. And so, in the 60s, he was busy in doing all that research. And then from that sprung a whole sort of, 30 or 40 year focus on dolphin intelligence and subjecting dolphins to that much testing for that long. Lo and behold, we found that, yes, they are strangely human-like or more ape-like than you would expect of a marine mammal with their ability for processing symbol systems, like language like symbol systems, and just problem solving and comprehension. Yeah, it was, so thanks to him.
Yeah, didn't he have some group that Carl Sagan belonged to, like the Club of the Dolphin or something like that? What was it called?
Yeah, what I forgot the name of it. Yeah, it was exactly that. It was because of the interest in SETI at the time. They were really interested in the Sagan, obviously, and everyone. The Green Bank people met, and they thought, how are we going to tackle first contact with alien life? And Lilly was there because he was attempting to establish communication with Order of the Dolphin. That was it. He was trying to establish contact with dolphins, speak to the dolphins, and so he got a bunch of funding, and Sagan was a big fan to see what he could accomplish with finances, establishing two-way communication. Famously, it did not work out very well, and Lilly went a bit off the deep end, as it were, with his experiments. We don't have to get into all those details, but we'll say that it kind of set back the field that I then got into a little bit, because studying dolphins became seen as a sort of a joke animal to study because of some of his shenanigans. But we dug our way out of that, and we springboarded from what he did find to placing dolphins really at this top of the pyramid of smart animals.
Right. Didn't he give them hallucinogens?
Yes, he tried to establish two-way contact he took LSD, and then he gave the dolphins LSD, and then he put himself in one of those flotation isolation tanks, which are very popular these days, and tried to psychically communicate. And as you probably know, it did not work, and it was frowned upon by the scientific community, and a bit of a bummer for his career.
Yeah, his chapter is called The Possibilities of Interspecies Communication, and then the book ends with this little passage here. The non-terrestrial, interplanetary, and astral sciences, the so-called space sciences, will benefit from our having established contact here on Earth with alien creatures that had an evolutionary development separate from ours in another kind of environment. Well, if we can't even talk to mammals on Earth, how are we going to talk to some extraterrestrial species on, whatever, planet Vega or something like that, right? That's the problem.
Well, that was the problem. And I think it's this idea of language assumes some level of intelligence similar to human-like intelligence. So all the things that we can do, understand the nature of the universe, use our ration and reason, might also be in the brain of a dolphin who is just simply communicating through a different means. So if we can crack the code, you can find the intelligence that's human-like behind it. And so the idea was, like, if an alien shows up and it's using like contact, the sort of stuff that Sagan wrote about, if they're using a weird symbol system or some other, like, if we can crack that code, we can get at the knowledge behind it. But of course, I think the way the field has panned out now is we realize dolphin language, animal language, I use that loosely as a lay term, it doesn't mean that there's the same human-like sort of thinking behind it. They have communication systems which are sophisticated, but they don't have language as we understand it for humans or the kind we're looking for in aliens.
You mean conceptual language, sounds that stand for something else that can be communicated, and the other creature you're communicating with understands the concept. So that's what you mean?
Well, sort of. Well, they do have that. Animals have, alarm calls, for example. My chickens have alarm calls. They'll have a different alarm call for a hawk or one for a ground predator. And those are, in a sense, a symbol that stands in for something that others chickens understand. So that's basic sort of to animal communication. But what makes humans human is that we can combine those in ways that allow us to represent anything we can think of. So concrete concepts, but also imaginary, irrational, strange concepts like time or, egalitarianism, or I don't know, you name it, we can create a word for it. Even if you try and teach like a chimpanzee or a dolphin to potentially put symbols together, they don't do that. And that's not because they're bad with symbols. It's because they probably don't have those thoughts to begin with, is the idea.
Right. Well, that gets us to your new book, because we often conflate intelligence and language, conceptual abilities, and so on, as some kind of mark of, well, I don't know what, intelligence, I suppose. I'm kind of repeating myself there, but what you're getting at is, in the thesis of your book, is that, if intelligence is so great, if having a huge brain is so super, how come almost nobody has it, and they seem to be doing quite well without a huge brain and all those intelligence abilities?
That's it. I mean, I'm just struck by the fact that humans lived for so long, most of our evolutionary history in Africa, alongside chimpanzees, actual modern day chimpanzees. And our lives were kind of the same. Even though we have the same ability we have now to build rockets, and understand particle physics, we weren't using it because it wasn't really necessary. We got by just fine, just like chimpanzees. But chimpanzees are getting by just fine without that ability either. So then the question is, well, what good is it really? I mean, yes, nowadays we're a very successful mammal. We're all over the place thanks to our intelligence. But the point I'm making in the book is like, well, if it's so great, A, why don't we see it more often? And B, if we think about the future, 5,000 years, like, are we even going to be here? And the reason we might not be is because of all of the things we've created with our intelligence, at which point intelligence itself as a biological solution doesn't seem all that great.
Right. Yeah, you talk about SETI in your book. Let's just talk about that for a second, because I was kind of thinking when I was listening to that part that, the reason SETI scientists look for radio signals is not that they're restricted in terms of how they think about alien intelligence. It's just that that's the only technology we have to listen, right? I mean, we can't send spacecraft to other stellar systems yet to find out if there's intelligent life there. The most we could do is send robotic spacecraft to our own planets, and the most we're going to find would be bacterial grade life on Mars, say. And that's not what SETI scientists do. NASA scientists do that. But, SETI's looking for something called intelligence, extraterrestrial intelligence. And, it's entirely possible, as you say, they don't use radio because they've graduated to some other technology. And, we would never know if we're just using radio telescopes to listen for those signals. So some people like Avi Loeb at Harvard are looking for extraterrestrial artifacts, right? So there might be like a Dyson sphere around some star, or parts of some kind of giant spacecraft that broke apart, or, as he thinks, maybe a extra solar system object entered our solar system, Oumuamua, he calls that one, that was probably just a space rock, but who knows? And so it's really restricted to what we can find, right? I mean, it's just you can define intelligence however you want, but if we can't even look for it, then what's the point of having a SETI program?
That's it. You either have to see it with a telescope that can see an object that was created by intelligence, or you have to hear it, presumably, through radio signals. And it's like, yeah, that point in the book is interesting, because humans didn't have radio for most of our history, and yet we were the same intelligence we are now. And as we shift to other forms of communication, soon our planet is going to stop sending out radio signals altogether. So there's this very, very brief window in which you can hear radio signals from Earth and know that we're intelligent. And if you were to look at if you were to look at the planet, maybe you might see some of the satellites we created, depending on the power of your visuals, but you're not going to find a giant extra planet that we've created nearby. So it's a blunt instrument, but it's the only instrument we have. Like you point out, how else are you supposed to do it? I don't know.
Right. Yeah, my thoughts on this is that they're probably out there. They probably haven't come here, so we don't need to talk about UFOs and UAPs. But the argument you make in the book, which I agree with, that is, it's sort of a Gouldian argument. There's so many contingent steps to get to intelligence, and most organisms do just fine without it, without huge brains and all that stuff we can do. The chances of it happening somewhere else are pretty slim. Now, the raw numbers are huge, right? 100 billion stars in our galaxy, 100 billion to a trillion galaxies. Pretty much every star has planets. If you have a half a dozen to a dozen planets, you're bound to get one around the habitable zone, and on and on and on through the Drake equation, and you end up with some number that's not zero beyond ourselves.
Yeah.
But, the distances between stars are so vast, the chances of us encountering them is pretty much zero. Physically encountering them. And as you say, picking up their signals is going to be very dependent upon whatever the technology happens to be. And we may just have missed that window. So, I don't know. It's Alfred Russel Wallace made this point back in Darwin's day that this led him to this idea of a higher power of some kind planting into the human species, a big brain. Because as he pointed out, chimps, a brain the size of a chimp or any primate is all you need, really. Why would natural selection create this thing that's like 4 times as big as it needs to be? And what do you need to do higher math for? If you're living in the plains of Africa, why do you have to be able to do calculus or, do quantum physics or aesthetic appreciation or any of that stuff? What's the purpose of it? So Wallace was a hyper-adaptationist. If he could not think of an adaptive purpose for something, then there has to be some other explanation. Darwin just said, well, we don't know yet. Here's some possibilities. Yeah. But do we know? Do we still not know what the answer is to that question? Why do we have such a gigantic brain?
That's a good question. And that's a good question from another angle, which is, do you need a large brain to be complicated, intelligent species? And there's so much beautiful research. Lars Chitka just published a book about the bee brain, and his big argument, which is really fascinating, which is you can achieve the same level of complexity in a human brain in terms of its computing power in a smaller form. We just happen to have created this intelligence using a big brain, but you can replicate it potentially in software, but certainly in a smaller brain. So the brain size itself isn't, if you're looking at modern neurobiology, such a big deal anymore. I think we're starting to appreciate that the size thing is it's almost a red herring. You can get intelligence without it, which is which is really fascinating. But nonetheless, it's true. We have a huge brain. Our brains are just big enough not to kill the mother coming out of the birth canal. That's like the max. That's as far as we're going to go. And they obviously are tied to our form of intelligence. But you make a good point, which is, we're doing all the really complicated math now, but we didn't used to. And that's sort of like a clue that the brain as we have it wasn't really designed to do astrophysics. It was doing something else with our intelligence. And that thing it seems to be doing seems to be social. It seems to be about understanding the behavior of other humans, communicating with them through language. And that's what it's been designed to deal with. All this other, things that we do, writing systems, for example, that's just a weird knock-on effect, an accidental byproduct of our intelligence, which never was selected for. There's just not enough time to select for that specifically, our ability to send satellites into space. How would you select for that now? That's impossible.
Right. Yeah, writing is another example. Learning to speak, it just comes naturally. I have a 6-year-old, and we never taught him to speak. We just spoke to him, and he just started speaking back. And but now he's about to start first grade, and he's learning to read and write. And oh boy, this is a massive effort. It's going to go on for years. And it's like, why is that? And it's only 5,000 years old, writing. And so you have these little squiggles, black squiggles on a white page or marks on a piece of clay. And somehow those come to represent something else. So whatever the human intelligence ability to do that must have been doing something else 1 million years ago or 100,000 years ago. What would that be?
Yeah, Exactly, and that's kind of what I'm looking at in the book, which is like, well, what are those core things that humans do very, very well that other animals do not seem to do as well? And one of them is this, causal reasoning. So we are interested at why things happen, and we're asking strange questions that animals don't ask about what causes another thing to happen, and that requires a number of cognitive things to be going on, and all of that cognition and the metacognition, the ability to think about your thinking. If you combine that with language, which is its own strange thing, then you've just unlocked this system, this combined cognitive system that can start doing things like inventing written language or astrophysics or math or whatnot. So once all those things have been built up together, you get the human intelligence, and that's how writing came about. So the book is really about trying to figure out what specifically are the human things that animals just don't have to the same extent.
Yeah, you make a distinction between, look at my notes, causal inference versus learned associations. So, like, we published an article in Skeptic by Louis Leidenberg, who is a professional animal tracker and a historian of science. If you can imagine that as a combined career choice. And his argument is that long form trackers, people that do long tracking over the course of days after wounding an animal, are doing a kind of causal reasoning as you talk about it. That is, they like hypothesis testing. Okay, so if the track looks like this and it's indented this particular way, and so we know he's going in that direction. Now we know the sun is off to the right and it's hot in the morning and there's some shade in the bushes over there. We can infer that he went that way. Now we test the hypothesis. We go over there and check if he's there. And now we see an indentation in the dirt where he laid. And then now we know there's water off to the right. So all this is this kind of hypothesis testing. He argues that that science is not, the method itself is not new in terms of cognitive abilities. We've been doing this for hundreds of thousands of years.
That's exactly it. That is beautiful. And that explains why it's useful. It's been useful to us. In the end, like chimpanzees were out there looking for food, they may not be able to do that, but they're also still really good using their learned associations and other forms of reasoning. But humans that's a great example because we are potentially evolved because of our ability to track animals over time, unlike other species. And it's all down to that kind of causal reasoning. So that is exactly why it's useful to a very early human. But like you say, if you apply that same kind of hypothesis testing, those questions that you're asking, to other things, like why is the sun coming up? Why when you see lightning do you hear thunder? Then you get into the kind of hypothesis testing that creates modern science, but also all previous forms of natural understanding. So yeah, it's powerful, and we learn to harness it for our engineering and technology and modern science.
So an animal that engages in learned associations, if they heard a rustle in the grass, and then they had to decide, is it a dangerous predator? Is it just the wind? And they're more likely to assume the type 1 error, make the type 1 error rather than make a type 2 error, which makes them lunge. They're not really doing any reasoning. They're not thinking, I wonder what that was. It could be, a dangerous predator. It's almost like an operant conditioning sort of thing. I heard a noise. Often noises are dangerous. Therefore, I'm going to make a type 1 error and just avoid it altogether. Something like that.
Yeah, and that's exceedingly powerful knowledge because you can build that up and remember all sorts of situations when this happened, that happened, those are associated. And that's how most animals, including humans most of the time, get by surviving on a day-to-day basis. And it has been the only way that any animal has ever gotten around for millions of years until humans added this new interest in causality. And it is, therefore, by definition, the most powerful form of thinking about how the world works in terms of longevity. And so it's I think people don't appreciate how amazing it really can be as a way of solving problems and getting by in this world. And because, as I point out in the book, when humans start trying to find causal connections, we also screw it up in monstrously ridiculous ways. I mean, that's almost in a way everything that you've been writing about for decades is all of the ways in which we get it so fundamentally boneheadedly wrong that it's comical and dangerous.
I was looking for your definition. Oh, here's your definition of intelligence. Well, you use AI researcher Pai Wang's definition of intelligence. The essence of intelligence is the principle of adapting to the environment while working with insufficient knowledge and resources. Accordingly, an intelligent system should rely on finite processing capacity, work in real time, open to unexpected tasks, and learn from experience. This working definition interprets intelligence as a form of relative rationality. That's interesting. So would a hive of bees be a kind of a swarm intelligence, or a, I don't know, wisdom of the crowds, or I don't know, what do you want to call it? Distributed intelligence is the term, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I love social insects in that sense, because they, on the individual level, they are actually doing a number of complicated things, as has been written about with their capacity for prediction and reasoning. But when you put them together as a swarm, the colony behaves quite rationally, and almost as if they're a number of neurons that have wired together to form their own brain as a social system. So they can do all that. I mean, they can do a limited number of things, but the things that they do are pretty complex. Like deciding on a new hive location, for example, is fantastic. You have the whole colony will leave with the queen, and then you have scout bees that go off and look for a new location. And they'll come back and they'll start doing a little dance that tells everyone the location of the hive, but also how good it is. But another bee will come back and find a different location. And then after a while, based on the number of bees that go out to check out those new hives and then come back and do the dance, you just have this sort of democratic system which naturally picks the best hive every time, because the most enthusiastic dancers, the largest number, and then off they go. And that's, on one hand, a really basic, stupid form of doing anything. On the other hand, an absolutely phenomenal system for picking a good hive. So, and that's, like you point out, that's like, what do you call that? Collective intelligence, distributed intelligence. It's a weird thing.
Or what would a octopus be? Because there's no brain per se, right? Its intelligence is distributed throughout its entire body.
That's it, because they've got clumps of neurons in their arms that can act semi-independently, making their own decisions. And it's, for us, with our form of like singular consciousness, it feels like we're one brain controlling a body, although maybe that's not true. It must be very different experience-wise to be an octopus, to have that kind of. And that's what's interesting when we talk about aliens. I love aliens. Like, we're always assuming that they've evolved in some sort of ape-like way to have our way of thinking about the world as complicated social species, but who's to say they're not like an octopus with this distributed intelligence, or a colony of insects like the Borg or something? Sci-fi writers are great at coming up with these ideas.
Right.
So who knows? The thing that makes humans destructive is because we are this kind of ape, which has our biological needs. We're very tribal. We're kind of violent sometimes. But imagine another kind of species evolved accidentally our kind of intelligence, but it didn't have the hangups of being a social primate. They might be better suited to not make themselves extinct by being more generous and kind to each other.
Yeah, we'll get to that, back to that in a minute, because you have that great phrase, prognostic myopia. That's one of the best phrases I've ever read. It's so well described the problem, right? That we can see the future, we just don't give a shit about it if it's too far out, right? But let's come back to this, because I wanted to mention Carl Sagan again was careful not to portray aliens like in Contact at all, because who knows what they're going to be like. In Cosmos, he had, like in the clouds of Jupiter, these kind of floaters and different kind of weird organisms. Because why would it be bipedal primates? Because that line only happened once out of the, 10 billion species that have evolved on Earth. Chances of that happening again are pretty slim. So, I've often been skeptical of alien abductions in which the aliens are always look like us, except, they have bulbous heads and almond-shaped eyes or whatever. And,
it's comical.
Sagan always pointed out, the chance of that repeating somewhere else. I don't know if you've ever seen that clip of him on Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show, where he's griping a little bit about Star Wars. Star Wars is populated, the galaxy's populated by these, basically white humans.
Yeah.
And, come on, really, except for the
Yeah,
bar scene in Star Wars, right?
exactly. I mean, it's like you say, the law of the large numbers. Like, eventually there will be intelligence out there, but like, it's an even larger set of numbers to think that they would be ape-like. That's obviously almost impossible and bonkers. Like, yeah, there'll be some other weird form. And what's interesting to think, like, we assume through natural selection they've turned into something, but maybe there's some other thing that's not natural selection that creates something so outside of our understanding of what a living thing is, that it's that's why you get Carl Sagan and folks coming up with weird gas cloud creatures. Who knows? Like, it could be anywhere.
Right.
I love it.
Yeah, that's right. That was Fred Hoyle's. Interstellar gas clouds that the molecules are able to communicate or somehow be connected, and then they can be doing calculations, or they can become conscious or sentient, something like that. And I should say,
exactly.
on the other side, I get pushback occasionally from that argument by people like Simon Conway Morris, who I had on the show here. He's big into convergent evolution. That there's certain things that come up over and over and over just by necessity. If you want to navigate through an ocean of water, you have to have something like a flipper, a fusiform body that can slide through the water, something to propel it, some guidance systems are along the way. Or if you want to live in the air, you have to have something like wings. There's lots of variation on wings, but there's only so much variation, because to get aerodynamic lift, there's only maybe a dozen or so. Or eyes. Eyes have evolved multiple times, but they kind of converge on the same sort of structure. To process photons of light, you have to have certain kinds of features. Anyway, his argument is that it's not entirely crazy that aliens would be something like bipedal. They won't be primates, of course. They could be bipedal dinosaurs or reptiles or whatever. But the idea is that with convergent evolution, you'll have like all the like sensory apparatus and brain apparatus on one end, the waste disposal system on the other end. You got to have some arms and legs to move around on the land if that's your environment, and so you're going to end up with something like that. That's the kind of pushback argument I hear.
That does make sense. Although I just like to widen the imagination. Like, that assumes a planet going around a sun with water. Why any of that? Why not just put out some weird molecules on an asteroid that's in the middle of nowhere with almost no gravity or something, and then those asteroids, like you're saying, coalesce into this weird collection of inorganic matter that can accidentally calculate? Sure. I mean, it makes intuitive sense, assuming natural selection is important to this process. But what if it's not?
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, let's talk about the problem of other minds. How do I know you're a sentient being? Maybe I'm the only one.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe, probably not. But how do you know what other animals are thinking, feeling? Is it not reasonable, like with that book, When Elephants Weep, to think, well, it sure looks like they're sad and depressed and moping around and feeling the loss of a loved one. You talk about the dolphins that push the dead infant around up to the surface, or the chimp that carried around her dead baby for weeks and so on. Is that not reasonable to kind of assume they look like they must feel like I feel when I look like that?
Yeah, I mean that's the study of animal behavior. If you studied ethology, like, all about this. This is the problem: is what is the best, simplest explanation? How do you use Occam's razor? Is it to say that complexity is the best explanation, or simplicity? And so when you're with another human, as you point out, it makes more sense for me to posit that your brain works like mine. Otherwise, how do I explain all of your behavior? Your behavior is so similar to mine. But then you start looking at your dog and a chimpanzee or a grasshopper, and it's so different from you that you don't necessarily need to explain a grasshopper's behavior with a huge level of complexity. You could say that the grasshopper is sad, or it's thinking about its own mortality. That's why it's not moving. Or it's just cold, and that's why its brain's... So where to draw the line? And so say you have a grieving animal, and this is the discussion in the field. Like, it looks and it's acting so human-like, pushing a baby around, carrying it, not eating, that what other mechanism is there to explain it other than grief? But then you have people come in to say, well, how does grief work? What specifically what mechanisms are involved that we know animals or suspect they have or don't have that would allow them to grieve like a human? And that's when you get into the details, and the details matter very much so. But I always love this argument of, if you assume an animal doesn't have a capacity like grief or can experience pain, and you get it wrong, that creates much more misery and suffering than assuming that they do have it and getting it wrong. Because at least you're erring on the side of caution and assuming the presence of things that could lead to better treatment. So I find that compelling. Not good science, good philosophy.
Yeah, so I wrote about Karen McComb's research. They show you the picture of these kind of grieving elephants, where she put different objects in the pens of these elephants in a reserve in Africa. There's like 24 different families of elephants, and she would put like a skull of some other animal, a skull of an elephant, and a tusk of an elephant, and a piece of wood or whatever. And then they would just kind of wander over there and go, oh, what's this? It's a novel. These are novel objects in their pen. And then she recorded the amount of time they spent poking around of the different objects, which obviously the wood, not so much, the other animal a little bit, the elephant skull a lot, the tusk a lot. And she said that they kind of touched the bottom of their feet apparently are very sensitive, and they touch the bottom of their feet and use their trunk to pick up the tusk, and and tusks are important to elephants and so on. So the assumption there is maybe we're just imposing our own feelings on elephants, but it seems like they're more interested in that because it's their own kind, and we know elephants will drag around a dead one for a while, or treat it in a way different than they would treat another dead animal that they happened upon.
Yeah.
Is that bad science? Is it good science? Is it just something different?
No, it sounds like the most reasonable explanation. I think you have to jump through more hoops to say, well, it's a weird coincidence, or there was something wrong with the experimental design, to come up with the alternate explanation of elephant stupidity. But I mean, these days, I think there's so much evidence to say that animals, like elephants specifically, or all animals, understand something about death. I talk about Susanna Monceau's research into what animals understand about death. And she makes great arguments to say that a basic understanding of death is pretty widespread, just to understand the difference between an alive thing and a dead thing. And you can even grieve like an elephant can grieve for another elephant, understanding that it's dead, without necessarily a huge level of complexity, without having to understand that seeing your dead relative means that you yourself also know that you are mortal and that you will inevitably one day die. So most researchers, Barbara King writes about this as well, they lack that specific understanding of death, although they understand they can still grieve and they can still mourn, and they understand something about death. So getting into the details about what they do and do not know gives you a better understanding of what it's like to be an elephant. But I'd say most people would say that what you're describing there is an example of dolphins. I'm always got dolphins on the brain, of elephants understanding something about death.
This is what you call the comparative thanatology. I guess the study of how different species. Yeah, it's really an interesting idea. How different species deal with death.
I find it because I'm interested in what animals know, and this specifically is fascinating to me because an understanding of death, like the way we have it, it requires an ability to put yourself into the far future, to think about your own future. And that episodic foresight, that kind of skill seems to be human specific to the extent that we can do it. And it's, again, tied into our understanding of other people and other minds and language and all the rest. So it's a real core ability. So comparative thanatologists want to know what specifically animals know about death. And that's a question about what makes us as humans so unique, because we understand it deeply. And so how does an elephant understand it, and why is that different? That's a great question.
Yeah, I wrote about this in Heavens on Earth, about when did humans first become aware of our own mortality? Well, it doesn't fossilize very well, so you have grave sites going back to Neanderthals, but a lot of them are not super clear that, why they buried them in the first place. Well, a simple answer is, well, the body's going to bloat up and stink, and, we just can't leave this thing laying around. We got to bury it, right? And then maybe some grave goods got in there by accident. There was one with flowers. Okay, maybe they put flowers in there. Maybe the flowers just by chance happened to go in there when they were shoveling the dirt in. But then there's this site here, this picture of this guy who had 1,200 beads. These were made out of, let me see, 30 to 35,000 years old, 2,936 beads along with 20 pendants and 25 rings, all made of mammoth ivory sewn into his clothing, which has since disintegrated. That can't be accident, right? And that's 35,000 years old. That it seems like, so again, the problem of other minds. I put myself into that, the minds of the people that buried him, and think, what would they be thinking? Well, they got to be thinking he's going somewhere, or we want to honor him, or we miss him, or I don't know what.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Because there's no traces left of what we were thinking in the archaeological record. You just have to take those examples and then try and extrapolate. And I also mentioned some gravesite stuff, but also these therianthropes. I think that's how you pronounce it. Those are the figurines that have an animal head and a human body. And you start seeing those around that same time period. And you're like, well, why would anyone make that? That's kind of weird. And that's when you start speculating, well, that must mean they're thinking about death, thinking about the afterlife, maybe coming up with concepts of animal-headed gods and these sorts of supernatural concepts. And it is, of course, guesswork. I mean, like you say, there's always an alternate, simple explanation. But I think you, again, are jumping through a lot of hoops once you start seeing this symbology that we know in the modern world is associated with understanding of an afterlife or concepts of it at that time for humans. So if you try and, it's a good game to try and guess, when did we first start thinking about our own deaths and mortality and the afterlife? Somewhere between the emergence of the first humans around 250,000 years ago and probably be by 40,000-ish, when our modern minds were what they were. But that's all massive speculation. But a reasonable conclusion, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, part of the problem is that you can't imagine not being alive, or you can't imagine being dead, because to imagine something, you have to be alive. You have to be sentient, conscious, aware. And so if I say, picture yourself dead, you can't really do it. You say, well, I can see myself there at the gravesite and people are hopefully feeling sad that I'm gone or whatever. But of course, you wouldn't be seeing anything, right? You're dead. And, to me, that's kind of the beginning of the idea of, well, there must be some continuation of consciousness. And then because we're natural born dualists, as Paul Bloom likes to call us, we imagine, because it feels like my thoughts are somehow floating around up there, separate from the protein material that holds them, and that when I die, it kind of floats off the brain and into the ether, or whatever, the quantum field or whatever it is, and continues on somewhere else, because that's what it feels like, right? And Paul has those examples in his book of children, very young, like age 3, that can imagine, the little alligator puppet alligator munches the little puppet mouse. And you ask the child, well, where's the mouse now? Oh, he misses his mommy and he's alone and he wishes he was with but he's still somewhere else, even though the body is munched in the stomach of the alligator, whatever. So this idea that we continue, that there's a kind of a dualistic soul of some kind, is pretty natural to humans.
That sort of checks out. I mean, if you imagine whenever this first human popped into existence that had all of these thoughts for the first time, that had the capacity to imagine, whatever that means, themselves dying, you're roped right into that would have to be this sort of weird concept of like, well, that can't be, because I am me, and how would you think about it? And so I think it's reasonable to conclude right from the get-go, as soon as we started understanding a concept of personal mortality, we were thinking about how that seems wrong. We must continue onwards, because how could there be anything other than me existing? So,
right, yeah, and I'm pretty confident my dog does not think that. He doesn't think, okay, well, where am I going to go? When I die, he doesn't have any concept of that. Okay, so part of your point is maybe that's not such a good thing to be able to do. Well, awareness of your own mortality.
Absolutely, and that's a sort of personal
Nietzsche.
Oh yeah, exactly, and that's a personal preference thing, because people ask me about that all the time, and because knowing that you're going to die, that motivates us to do all these things in the world, make a difference, maybe make a piece of art that lasts after you die, where, these immortal pieces, we want to be remembered. We want to do good in the world. And so it creates a lot of great behavior, humans doing very nice things, creating art, music, etc. So it drives us to create this knowledge of death. But then on the other side is like, thoughts of suicide, that is all wrapped up into these concepts of existential dread and knowing that you're going to die. It has a negative consequence on us as humans, anxiety and those sorts of things. And of course, it leads to ideas about the afterlife and religious things, which I'm sure you could talk at length about, sometimes not always that great for us. And so on balance, is it better to know that you're going to die or not? And then you look at your dog and you're like, well, their lives are difficult. Our lives are difficult. Their lives are happy. Our lives are happy. They just seem better off not worrying about it. And maybe that's a better way to be. And that's what I say in the book. But I mean, maybe some people would love thinking about mortality. Great. Not me. Makes me kind of bummed out.
Yeah. Or you could be like Woody Allen, where you don't want to live on in the hearts and minds of your countrymen. You want to live on in your apartment. Right? Reputation it doesn't really give you immortality because you are not continuing at all, right? It's just your offspring or your offspring of your pen and whatever your work is. So let's talk about this prognostic myopia, because it's the same problem, right? That we can project ourselves into the future, and yet here your argument is that we discount the future pretty steeply, pretty rapidly. Why is that?
Yeah, all of biology is about solving problems in the here and now. If you look at the way animals think about the future, it's usually a little bit into the future, a few minutes, a few hours. Sometimes you have examples of animals planning for the next day, or even maybe 2 days. But it's relatively rare. Most of the problems that we deal with are the here and now in terms of conscious decision making. And so our biology drives us to make those decisions. You feel an emotional response. You're hungry, you're angry, you're sad. That's all about what's happening now. And then you have humans who come on the scene, and we're thinking about 5 years down the road. Maybe I want to move to France and build a house or whatever. We've got these plans, we've got these ideas. But our biology is not designed to give us an emotional response to those kinds of thoughts in the same way it's, what am I going to have for dinner? I'm hungry. I need a Snickers bar. That's in the here and now. That's important to us. And even all of the rest of it is intellectual exercises, which are great. But intellectual exercises often give us bonkers rationalized solutions that are bad. Whereas for the most part, our emotional responses to things are good for us, better for us. And so the split is prognostic myopia, which is we could think about the future, we just don't have an emotional response to it that is helping us. And so it's up to our intelligence to always create those good futures, and it often lets us down.
Right. So something like 60% of Americans do not have enough money for retirement. Actually, they don't have enough saved up even if they miss like 2 months of work. Right. So that, I don't know if that's just pure economic issues, but it's also part of the problem of planning for the future. It's hard for us to think, well, I'm 25 and someday I'm going to be 65. Yeah, I'll worry about that when I'm in my 30s or something like that. And then you just keep pushing it off because it just seems like, well, I got so many problems tomorrow and next month and next year. I just can't think about those sorts of long-term things.
That's it. And so saving for the future requires you to really think about ways to get around your biology, because you're almost fighting against yourself. You're like, well, I'm going to have money automatically deducted from my paycheck and put in the savings because otherwise I'm going to spend it. We know we're going to spend it in the moment. So you have to come up with a system to force yourself to not screw it up. And that again is fighting our biology, because our biology, like I don't have anything saved the way I should. Like and I know I should be saving, but I don't, because I'm like, well, I want to go out. I'm going to use that money to go to the restaurant tonight. That's a problem of the here and now. And so it's this constant battle with our ability to think about our retirement, but not actually really care about it that much. That's a good example.
Yeah, it's like there's more than one you. There's multiple yous. There's you now. There's your future you. Like there's tomorrow you. So the examples I use is, I lay out the night before my workout clothes, my cycling gear and stuff, because I know I'm going to be fumbling around in the morning and I'm going to oversleep and I'm not going to be motivated. So current Shermer knows future Shermer is going to be weak at 6 in the morning. So I got to kind of set up the conditions now for that weak guy. It's like, Homer Simpson, when Marge warns him about not drinking too much, that's future Homer's problem, that sucker.
Yeah.
Right.
No,
so it kind of feels like that.
And that's all. And that's just an individual like you, Michael, of trying to fight for your own best interests, and you still have a hard time. Imagine a government trying to plan for its population's good future 30 or 40 years down the line. It's just a lost cause. All those people trying to think their way through a problem with no real emotional response helping them. And that's where the big problems come in, because the climate emergency is a great example. Like, we know exactly what you need to do right now today to fix the climate emergency. We could stop burning fossil fuels and everything would be fine. I mean, it'd be a bummer for a lot of things, but that's the answer. But like, that's hard. Like, I need to get to the store. I got to buy food. I got to put gas in my car. Like, so I'm going to do that, even though I know it's probably not good. And so that is the battle, especially when you're dealing with large numbers of people in the far future.
Yeah. So here I like Cass Sunstein's work on libertarian paternalism, or nudge, as he calls it. That is to say, choice architecture. So he famously worked for the Obama administration, where the government can do things like famous examples. I'll give you a tax break if you're married, and more tax break if you have children. Maybe we'll even send you a check. I forget what it is now, like $500 a kid. And if you buy a home, we'll let you deduct the interest on the mortgage off your income taxes. So these are all ways of the government saying, we want you to be a long-term thinker, have kids, own a home, invest in retirement. So, corporations will, offer employees like 6 different retirement plans, high risk to low risk. And you get to pick. So you're still libertarian, but we're kind of paternalistically nudging you to do something that's going to help your future self.
Yeah. And I mean, that's kind of in a way what governments are about, and what are trying to do are to come up with structural governmental institutions that prevent people from making bad decisions. But which is good. But as I'm sure you can point to 1,000 examples of a government coming up with a policy that seems like a good idea, but creates a lot of misery and then doesn't work. Like there's so many examples, I don't even have to give you any. And so, and again, that's because those intellectual arguments about planning for the future are all intellectual arguments, and our brains aren't designed to have that work out. We're still stuck in the moment for the most part, and I think it's an insurmountable problem. I don't know how the world could organize itself using just our thinking to solve climate change today, because of the way humans are. Humans huge. Are, yeah.
It's such a long-term problem, because, you're talking about, like, even the measures we're taking now having some effect by 2100. 2100? I mean, that just sounds like forever. I can't even imagine thinking that far in advance. And then you get these calculations by different people. Well, it's only going to lower the temperature by 1/2 of 1 degree by 2100. We're going to spend X trillion dollars to do that, and it's not worth it. And then you get these cost-benefit calculations and so on. And at some point, it's like, listen, I just got to go to work tomorrow, or I got to make my mortgage next month, and I got to get my kid off to school. I can't think about 2100.
Yeah, that's exactly, and which is a completely normal human response. But that's the point. Our completely normal human psychology and behavior makes it impossible to do those long-term the right things, which I get. I'm a human. I do it wrong all the time, but that's the point. And so I think when you're trying to make policy, you have to start with human psychology first, understanding why we aren't necessarily going to do the right thing, and try and come up with some system to work around it, whatever these incentivized systems you talked about. Try and find one that works, and good luck with that, because that's hard.
Yeah. Yeah, these are collective action problems. No one of us is going to make any difference at all, but we got to get everybody on board. So, if there's a war, say, okay, so we got to stop the Nazis, and all right, we're all going to ration and we're going to do this and we're going to do that. But at least there's some, kind of light at the end of the tunnel, right? It's just a couple years and we're there. Problem with climate, again, is like, well, we got to do this for the next century.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's like not even going to be around.
And the problem with climate is that the changes and the problems are kind of slowly accumulating. So if you just walk outside, you don't see a problem necessarily. But if there's a war going on and you walk outside and there's Nazis walking down your street, okay, that's an immediate problem. We can rally behind the allies, and so that will always thwart us, and then you get these like, well, it's hotter now than it was, and look at these fires, that's because of climate change. But it doesn't feel the same. And then of course you get people denying that that's actually even the case. And so it's unlike a war in the sense that it's the problems aren't as immediate really. Cumulatively over 50 years they will, but not today.
Yeah. I always liked Richard Dawkins' idea of middle land, as he called it, that as we evolved on the savannas of Africa, in which everything was kind of middling size, middling speed, middling time, say between ants and elephants, a grain of sand, a mountain range, a speed of, maybe a tortoise and a cheetah. Those are the kinds of things we're intuitively wired up to perceive. I can imagine tomorrow, next year, the seasons changing, the moon, whatever. You get these kind of cycles that we can sort of keep track of. These bushes will come to fruition, literally, in 6 months from now. But, the idea of like evolution, it takes place over millions of years. It's like, I don't even know what that means, millions of years. There's nothing in my intuitive psychology to hook on to that. Or, the speed of light. It's just inconceivable. Or, a galaxy, or expanding bubble universe. There's nothing in our evolved psychology to kind of grasp those things. So we use metaphors, right? String theory, it's like this, it's like that, sort of grasping for something to hook it on in there that makes sense.
It's true. And the seasons is a good example. Like I can look at my maple tree and be like, oh, I can imagine it losing its leaves and then tapping it in the next spring. But it's difficult for me to imagine that same plot of land 300 years in the future when this house is gone and that tree's not there. Like that's just, I can't imagine that. It's just, there reaches a point when your imagination and your ability to comprehend these big numbers and it's gone. But the bummer thing about humans, and that's why prognostic myopia is an issue, is that we have enough intelligence to make things to affect that future. We can create a building that will be there after we die. We can create nuclear warheads that will explode and destroy the earth, and that'll be there after we die. We can create things that change that future, but we don't really care, or we can't feel it. It doesn't mean as much as the now or the seasons even.
You write here about, let's go to the darker side of human nature, that surveying the chickens in your yard, you write, they're unlikely to unite en masse to rain down upon the world in pursuit of the glory for the great chicken nation. And then as you write, narwhals do not build gas chambers. Okay. Yeah. So what's the problem here?
Well, then you get into the moral issue, which is humans can use our rationality and our intellect to reach moral conclusions based on religion, based on philosophy, however you get there, about what is the right thing and the wrong thing to do for the greater good or whatever good you have. And then we can execute that. And sometimes the things that we do for moral reasons, if we look back at them from the future, we realize, oh, that was repugnant. That was terrible. We brought about suffering and death, and it was a bad thing. But in the moment, we thought it was the right thing. And that the history of our species is us cycling through what's the right thing to do in relation to other people, and usually bringing about a lot of suffering. So that's what's a bummer about the human capacity for moral thinking, unlike chickens, because chickens don't wrestle with those same problems. They do have norms that force them to be nice to other chickens, these emotions in their minds that create chicken society, but they don't then think about them, turn them into laws, turn them into moral ideas about why they have to go and execute all the other chickens next door in the neighboring yard. That's a human concept. And it's, as I write about in that chapter on morality, it's a real bummer because we have the ability to be really nice to each other and nice to other animals. But a lot of the time we do things like genocide, the Holocaust, or the residential schools that I write about in Canada. We create so much suffering with that ability.
Right. Paul Bloom wrote that great book, Against Empathy. What he meant was that our capacity to empathize and be gregarious with our fellow group members and love them, cooperate, be pro-social, altruistic, reciprocally altruistic, and so forth, all the good stuff, then makes us even more hostile to any threat to our fellow group members, right? So those guys over there, they're the problem, and they're going to hurt us, and then you end up with genocide.
Yeah, and that's, again, it's our particular form of primate, great ape species, does have that issue seemingly baked right into us. You talk about bonobos, which are famously slightly less violent, they solve more problems with sex. They aren't as territorially mean to each other as chimpanzees. So, and maybe we're more like a chimpanzee to some extent. Well, imagine a scenario where we had the same intellect, but we were coming out of a different kind of social mammal that had empathy, but like we're just seemingly less concerned with our other tribes and neighbors and got along better. It's possible. Or maybe baked into intelligence is this rivalry. I don't know. But yeah, it's really baked into our DNA going back to before we had this kind of intelligence. But then we use that kind of intelligence to justify all that sort of tribalism, which is, it's the saddest thing. People talk to me all the time. I'm like, hey, people are mean to each other. And they're like, yes, but we have the capacity for empathy and animals don't. I'm like, yes, that's true. But that makes it worse because we look at all the suffering we cause, right, even though we have this empathy.
So would a solution be then to make everyone an honorary member of our tribe, part of our extended family, our community? Just how do we get people to care about somebody on the other side of the planet? I don't even know.
I don't. That's how do we solve all the world's problems? I have no idea. It seems almost an impossible task. I mean, it has to, like these utopian societies that we think of, like in Star Trek. I mean, they're fun to think about, but how do we get there? I mean, everyone has open access to all resources, and we have everything we need. That's a good way to start. But even that, I mean, I have that right now with my neighbors, and they still drive me crazy sometimes. And we're not fighting each other, but like humans are never going to get along. It's just a matter of minimizing the amount of damage we do to each other. And that comes from a good form of government, a global government, I don't know, laws that function correctly, or some sci-fi scenario where there's an AI that makes all the decisions, or who knows?
Yeah, I like the Star Trek example because, Nichelle Nichols just died, and so that story about Martin Luther King telling her to stay on the show, she was going to quit apparently, because just seeing somebody who is a person of color in a high command position on a starship, no less, fourth in command, right? And that effect, now we have our first African-American woman Supreme Court justice. I think there is some evidence that the exposure to people who are different from us in positions of power, or at least equal to us who have power, then expands the moral circle. Peter Singer's expanding circle, or I prefer expanding sphere in 3 dimensions, that, we just make those people in our minds, it almost tricks us into thinking, well, that person is like me, so, like knowing a gay person. Oh, well, they're actually kind of normal, so I guess I don't have to, think of them as weird or abnormal or anything like that. And that's the idea, I think, of the expanding circle.
Yes, I love that representation in media, a positive representation, is exactly how you get people to expand the circle without having to do very much. Just seeing someone on TV who's different, who they then respect as a character, and then they see someone like that in real life, they're going to be nicer. That's, again, basic, boring human psychology. And I'm always surprised at how many people are still homophobic, even around here where I am. And then you talk to them and you realize,
really?
Well, they've never spoken to a gay person in their lives. But as soon as they do,
that
becomes
they
a
know
lot
of.
harder. Yeah. Well, exactly. But then they do, and their lives change, or they speak to one of the local Syrian refugees, and everything changes about how they feel about Syrians. And so, yeah, that's one way to do it. But I mean, so I guess are good Netflix episodes or television shows, maybe that's the answer. But at the same time, so many of the social problems we see of immigration and people bumping into each other, and those just seem old and hard to solve. But there are countries that do an okay job of solving it better than others. And yeah, I don't know how you do it. Good Netflix. I know you didn't say Netflix, but I'm going to agree with you that we need better Netflix shows, better representation.
Oh, I like Netflix. I binge watch them all the time. But what you're after there is bottom up versus top down. We need both, I think. To change people's hearts, it has to come from the bottom up, I think, through pop culture, through literature, film, television, interactions with other people. There, our kind of moral consciousness just kind of gradually, slowly comes around. You don't even really notice it. Versus top down, I'd really rather not have to pass laws at the, kind of the threat of force or violence if you don't do this. But sometimes you do need that. Like, I think in America, we needed that to end slavery. I don't think it was going to come about gradually on its own, at least not until maybe the 20th century. So that brought it about 40 years earlier. Sometimes you have to have laws that say you cannot discriminate against these people here based on these characteristics. Boom, 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 boom. And that's it. And if you don't do it, we're sending men in with guns, like the integration of schools. Both Eisenhower and Kennedy had to send federal troops into Alabama.
Yeah, that's right.
And tell them, look, you're going to integrate these schools. And the governor famously said, no, we're not. And Kennedy said, yes, you are. And I'm sending men in with guns, and you're going to do it. And sometimes that's what it takes, right? Now, maybe when the old guys are all gone, the old racist guys are dead and gone, and the new generation grows up with the new attitudes, they don't need the law anymore. It's probably good to have it on the books just in case. But, in the long run, I think that kind of just sort of slowly, gradually, although in the case of same-sex marriage and homosexuality, that happened pretty fast, right? I mean, 2011, by 2010, it was still a majority of Americans were against gay marriage, slightly more, like 55%. And then in 2011, it flipped. It was like 55% in favor. And both Hillary and Obama said they were in favor of same-sex marriage. In 2015, the Supreme Court justice voted it in the law of the land. That's pretty fast.
It is, and I agree that in especially when it comes to human rights and groups that are discriminated against, legislation is a very easy way to fix the problem relatively quickly. If you can no longer be openly hostile and beat your gay neighbor because it's illegal, then life will be a lot better for them. You can still be secretly homophobic or a racist at home around the dinner table, but you're not going to go out and commit terrible acts, and that helps. So that will change things pretty quickly. But then you get into other social issues like bullying is a thing in my daughter's school. Is we don't want as much bullying. We don't like bullying. And so you're trying to change the heart and minds of the kids. Like, the rules have always been the rules. You can't bully, but of course everyone does. And so you try and change the heart and minds of kids by talking about it and exposing them to anti-bullying messaging. And of course bullying still happens and will always happen. So I think when you don't have the rules in place, like, it's going to run rampant. So you have to be ever vigilant to stop humans doing the things that humans do, which is be weirdly tribal and very nervous of things that are different. We don't like different things in our circles. So you have to take that into account for sure in laws.
Your daughter. So do you mean other girls are bullying? I mean, like Mean Girls kind of thing?
No, yeah, well, just like I remember when she was younger, just like anything, especially small kids who are like 8 or 9, if someone's wearing a funny jacket that looks dumb, they'll say mean things to them, or so just like standard bullying stuff. But there's so much focus on anti-bullying these days, which is great. But it's fascinating to me how much anti-bullying messaging they get, and then when they get to junior school, they're like 12 or 13, how mean they are to each other, because humans are just at that age just naturally mean, unless you have all these like rules in place to stop them from being awful to each other. And even then, they'll still do it secretly in the bathroom. They'll be mean to each other.
Is that like your chickens with their pecking order? It's like a hierarchy thing?
It seems to be. Well, that's what's fascinating about people, because we have all this really intelligent ability to talk, blah, 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 blah. But if you just turn off the sound and watch a bunch of, 12 or 13-year-old kids playing on the playground, it doesn't look any different to chimpanzees running around beating on each other, or my chickens with their pecking orders. We're all just social mammals doing regular social mammal stuff.
Okay, let's go back to the title of your book, If Nietzsche Were a Narwhal. Here's what you write. If Nietzsche had been born a narwhal, the world might never have had to endure the horrors of the Second World War or the Holocaust. Nietzsche both wished he was as stupid as a cow, so he wouldn't have to contemplate existence, and pitied cows for being so stupid they couldn't contemplate existence. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay, why Nietzsche?
Well, it was really, he didn't write all that much about human or animal morality and what we should learn from animals. Just a few passages here and there, but the ones that he did write were great. It was exactly that. He talked about the cows in the field, and he was saying, well, they don't understand the concept of time. They live in the moment. They don't contemplate their deaths. And I bet that would be pretty good, he said. So I'm like, great. That's a great place to start off from. First of all, do they understand the concept of time? And I write a lot about what animals do understand. And it's actually way more than Nietzsche would have suspected. But in the end, they don't necessarily think about their own deaths. And then let's try and answer the question he was asking. Like, is all this knowledge good for us? Because he was a miserable dude. And a lot of his writing, as I mentioned there, did end up being used to justify the Nazi ideology. And so would the world, have been better off without all of his thinking? And would he have been better off without all of his thinking? What if he had just been a cow? The world would have been a better place for him. Maybe. That's what he said. He might be right.
Who is it that said, better to be Socrates unsatisfied than a pig satisfied? I forget what philosopher said that now.
Yeah.
That might have been Hume, or I don't know.
Well, that is true, because I wrestle with the fact, like I like being a human. I love thinking. I love music and Netflix and all these other thoughts that we have. This is great fun for me. So I think I quite like my intelligence, and I would not want to be just a chicken running around necessarily. But I have to admit that they may be, on a day-to-day basis, maybe happier than I am, because pretty miserable guy. I'm a writer. Of course I'm miserable. And then
you are? You're miserable? Really?
Yeah, I mean, that's how you get the words on the page. At least that's how I mean, you've written so many books. Maybe you're not miserable. I think that's the exception, not the rule. But then you look at all of that misery in the long term for our species might be a liability, which is what I argue. So I don't know. It's personal preference. So if you want to be a chicken or a human.
I wouldn't want to be Nietzsche for sure, because he was mentally ill. So I'm not sure he's the exact example. But I thought of a passage from, since you mentioned Steve Pinker in your book, I wanted to read what he said about Nietzsche, because it's just such great prose here, and why Nietzsche is a probable character. If one wanted to single out a thinker who represented the opposite of humanism, indeed, of pretty much every argument in this book, one couldn't do better than the German philologist Friedrich Nietzsche. Earlier in the chapter, I fretted about how humanistic morality could deal with a callous, egoistic, megalomaniacal sociopath. Nietzsche argued that it's good to be a callous, egoistic, megalomaniacal sociopath. Not good for everyone, of course, but that doesn't matter. The lives of the mass of humanity, the botched and the bungled, quoting Nietzsche here, the chattering dwarves, the flea beetles count for nothing. What is worthy in life is for a superman, Übermensch, literally overman, to transcend good and evil, exert a will to power, and achieve heroic glory. Only through such heroism can the potential of the species be realized and humankind lifted to a higher plane of being. The feats of greatness may not consist, though, in curing disease, feeding the hungry, or bringing about peace, but rather in artistic masterworks and martial conquest. And then he goes on, quoting lots of stuff from Nietzsche, which sounds pretty bad. And then, as Pinker then concludes, the idea, Nietzsche's ideas fail the first test of moral coherence, namely generalizability beyond the person offering them. If I could go back in time, I might confront Nietzsche as follows. I am a superman, hard, cold, terrible, without feelings and without conscience. As you recommend, I will achieve heroic glory by exterminating some chattering dwarves, starting with you, Shorty, and I might do a few things to that Nazi sister of yours, too. Unless, that is, you can think of a reason why I should not. That's just great.
Yep, that is great. I forgot he had written that. I had read that at some point. Yeah. Nietzsche's his philosophy was not very difficult for his sister, who was a huge Nazi sympathizer. He himself was not Nietzsche. He was sort of in his comatose state before much of that happened. But like not difficult to take that and then turn it into ideology about the superiority of the Aryan race and that sort of thing. So his actual philosophy was a bummer, and it was again so human focused. He didn't say much about animals and our obligation toward animals depending on what kind of cognitive capacities they have, and that sort of philosophizing always bugs me as somebody who's into animals and animal thinking. So he's a good jumping off point. I wouldn't emulate much of his life. It doesn't sound like he was having much fun. And I wish he had been a cow.
I would definitely be a narwhal instead of him.
1,000%.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so go back to where we started on intelligence. At the beginning of the book, you challenge the idea that, we don't really know exactly what it is. I think that's true across the board. But, what is it all these psychologists who study intelligence, I mean, there's journals and books and so on, what is it they're studying? I mean, can we at least narrow it to, with humans, this is what we mean by intelligence, or is it really that slippery a concept?
I think if you stick within human intelligence, there's lots of operational definitions, but you're usually testing sort of the same stuff that was in that previous definition, the flexibility of thinking, that applying one concept to other concepts, and then there's just your basic sort of math and language skills and capacities, and so you can define it and study it that way, and then you have this general intelligence concept, which is if you're good on one kind of psychometric test, you'll be good on another kind of psychometric test. So what does that mean about your brain? Is there one thing that creates all of that goodness, or are those just things working in parallel? Who knows exactly what it is? So it does make sense to study intelligence and to divvy it up as to what kind of intelligence: social intelligence, physical, sport intelligence. It's all well and good, but it usually never applies to animals. There's only a handful of those tests that you could even pretend to give to a chimpanzee and have it make any sense whatsoever. And yet we always talk about animals being intelligent. And so that's what I'm saying. Like, well, what are you talking about when you say that your cat is intelligent? And you usually mean, it's doing something human-like. So that's important to understand, or an AI system. What do you mean by intelligent? What kind of thing do you need it to do to be intelligent, according to your definition?
Right, solving problems. So, like Big Blue famously beat Garry Kasparov in chess. So it's really good at solving a particular kind of problem. Although, as I like to point out, it didn't even know it's playing chess. It doesn't know who Garry Kasparov is. It doesn't know anything, right? It doesn't even know that's what it's doing. And or Watson, IBM's Watson beating Ken Jennings and Brad Rutter in Jeopardy, the two greatest Jeopardy champions of all time. But it doesn't even know it's playing Jeopardy. It doesn't know it won. It's not excited. It's just, this idea that we're close to sentience with AI, I think is pretty far afield. I just had Gary Marcus on the podcast. He's pretty skeptical of a lot of this AI stuff. Like the Google guy that said his language program had become sentient. It's ridiculous.
Yes, that's
not
right.
even remotely close to this.
Yeah,
right?
I'm in the same camp.
You are.
Yeah,
Okay, good.
I am.
Because I think we're a long ways from this.
Oh yeah, because those are all specialist things. Like you can design an AI to do a thing, and it can be very good at it. Like the AI that can beat players in StarCraft, and I always find that to be the best example of an AI that's doing a smart thing, because that's a very unlike chess. It's very complicated. There are a lot of unknowns, and there's so many iterations of things it could do. That's a powerful machine, and it's great, but it does the one thing. Making a generalist machine that can do all of the things that even your dog could do is a fantasy. And there's lots of good reasons, I think, as to why I don't think it's going to work, and it has to do with the way brains evolved in tandem with bodies, in tandem with the world on the outside. Like there's a whole history there that you can't necessarily replicate. So I love the optimism. I just don't think it's going to come to fruition anytime soon before we make ourselves extinct anyway. That's my thought on it. So
Do you have an opinion on the hard problem of consciousness and how that could even be solved in principle?
I see. I do provide a sort of a whole chapter. There's a whole chapter on consciousness and what it is in the book, and I understand it, at least from a biological perspective, as if you use a definition that's very boringly basic, like the experience of something. Anything that a brain experiences, not like these chess computers. They most likely don't have subjective experience of anything. But if you just leave it at subjective experience, it doesn't require a lot of complicated thinking. It's simply like, this feels good, this feels bad, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty. And if a brain has knowledge of that, it's easier for that brain to make a decision about what to do next. And so I think putting a feeling into consciousness allows a brain to make a decision better than if it were just some subconscious automated system. Of course, we make a lot of decisions subconsciously, but not all of them. In fact, not most of them on our daily routine. We're consciously aware, and that's probably how animals, including insects, also deal with decision making. So as I say in that chapter, the thing that makes us unique is we have way more of which we are capable of being conscious of. All of our thoughts we can think about, and that makes us unique. But consciousness itself, I agree with the sort of modern ethologists who are maybe still out there, I guess, who say that it's relatively widespread. But then the main problem of like, how could you ever know? You won't. That problem will remain. These are all just a stance we've decided to take as best explanation for animal behavior. But again, I don't know that you're conscious. So who cares? I'm going to treat you as if you are, and that makes more sense to me.
Yeah, I solve it by just applying the Copernican principle to myself. I'm not special. And if you show the same signs behaviorally on your face, emotions, and so on that I do, and I feel a certain way, it's a reasonable assumption you probably feel something close to those same internal states.
Yeah.
And then from there, you could, again, go to elephants or, whatever chimps that seem to grieve. Not unreasonable to think they probably feel something like what I feel when I feel bad, a loss. That seems reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, I remember I talk about these concepts with my students, my seminar students in my Animal Minds course. And on the last day, I get up with a couple students and we argue that Roombas are conscious. And then we have them try and fight us on this. And I'm like, well, but look what it's doing. And so I'm trying to explain its behavior as if it's making conscious decisions. And they have to come up with arguments as to why it's not conscious. And it's way harder than you would possibly think. But in the end, we don't treat Roombas as if they're conscious most of the time. Our default settings for deciding what is and isn't conscious works great. It's effective. And why not just assume it? Because again, the chance if you're wrong and the animal does have subjective experience, but you treat it as if it doesn't, then that's more of a problem. And we don't usually treat Roombas as if they're conscious. Therefore, it's not a problem. I'm big into the folk.
Right, but Data on Star Trek has crossed that uncanny valley because, well, it's an actor, and the scripts are written for the actor to act pretty much like a human, except for doesn't use contractions and has kind of pale skin.
That's right.
My friend Leonard Mlodinow, who's been on the show a couple of times, he used to write for Star Trek. He's a physicist and wrote a book on emotions most recently. And so we were talking about this, and he makes the point that if Data was really an AI, like as we understand AIs and how we build them currently, it wouldn't do anything. It would just sit there on the bridge unless you programmed it. Now, when Captain Picard walks on the bridge, you are to stand up, turn around, greet Captain Picard, say the following lines. But that isn't what we see. He goes, we can't write Data like that. We have to write him like he's a human,
yeah.
Except with these little quirky things. Otherwise, there's nothing there.
Yeah. And I mean, if someone were to ever create one of these sort of P-zombie style data machines, which acts as if it's conscious and tells you it's conscious, but it's not conscious, really, great. We've all been fooled. We're all wrong. But I don't think that's going to happen. We always can tell the difference between something somebody in these Turing test chatbot things like, oh, well, there, it got it wrong. We know, we figured it out. Because we're very sensitive to the concept of other minds as humans. And so we are not easy to fool. I mean, come fool me. If someone's got a deep AI that can come fool me into marrying it because I think it's a human woman, great. But that's not going to happen, I don't think.
You mean not just a sex bot?
Well, yeah,
something
I mean,
you actually care about.
I guess you can marry sex bots in some places, but no, yeah, I mean, fooling me into thinking that it's a real person,
Right.
conscious person.
Right. Yes. Well, I guess a psychopath would be a kind of a version of this where they're pretty good at fooling other people into thinking that they care about them when actually they don't. And apparently psychopaths they're not good at theory of mind. They can't read other people's minds really, but they can figure out the kind of cues they should give if they did care, right?
So that's fascinating.
It's kind of a version of that.
It's a bit like a philosophical zombie in that they lack that level of empathy. They're good at behavior reading. They're good at manipulation. They're very intelligent in that sense. And yet, you would never say that a psychopath isn't conscious. And that goes back to the way I'm understanding consciousness, which is consciousness is subjective awareness. And so they have subjective awareness of everything you and I have. They just don't have any feelings of empathy. It's just not a thing that enters into their consciousness. But the consciousness is not that. Consciousness is any subjective experience of anything. And they're just missing a few bolts. But otherwise, they're just as conscious. So that's why I think consciousness is useful to understand as just subjective experience. And the rest of it is cognition, of which the animal or the human is or is not aware.
So in that sense, your chickens and the bees, they are conscious in the sense that it is something like to be a bee or a chicken.
Yeah.
They know what it is.
Yeah. And we can't. That's the hard problem. We're not going to know what it is, but who cares? We just assume they have at least
Right.
the most basic of things, pleasure, well, of course they should be able to taste honey versus something that's not honey and have an experience of that. That explains why they prefer one thing. If you have a preference, you have preference utilitarianism, that's a whole thing, then you're worth considering.
All right, Justin, do you want to meander into the quagmire of free will and determinism and tell us where, if your chickens don't have it, but we do, where that comes up?
I can't even begin to get into free will and determinism. I don't even have an opinion on that really when it comes to this level of consciousness. And because I don't think that matters either, whether or not your mechanics of your brain force you to do things. Doesn't matter to me. If I'm experiencing something, and however it got into my conscious mind as an experience, it's something we need to be concerned about. I'm concerned about it. If my chickens, if they have no free will but they can experience pain, I still have to deal with that. So I need to do something about it. So anytime there's pleasure or pain, we have to consider our actions in relations to that thing from a moral standpoint. So I don't care. If whether or not I have any free will doesn't bother me. I'm still going to be hungry and have to pee.
I'm not sure why people are obsessed with these questions, but they are. I mean, this comes up a lot, and there's just tons of books. I get books probably once a month on free will. It's just endlessly debated. But I always like Jeremy Bentham's little quip about animals. It's not can they talk or can they reason? Can they suffer?
Yes. And that is the basis for modern welfare and rights arguments, and where Peter Singer's books come out on that. And I talk about that in the end of my book when I'm trying to figure out why anything matters at all with animals and their thinking. And I just find I don't take any hard stance on rights, or as you note in the book, or welfare. I'm just saying, like, pleasure seems to be the thing that makes the most sense if we're trying to figure out what's good and bad about human or animal intelligence. And the creating pleasure or minimizing pain seems like a worthy goal in our own lives, a worthy goal in biology, because it seems as if biology itself from the very beginning is about providing animals with a feeling of pleasure or pain because that drives them to do things. Therefore, it's valuable. Therefore, it's worth something, pleasure and pain. And so why not use pleasure as the metric to understand our relationship to things, whether or not it's an AI or a chicken? So yeah, it is old school Bentham utilitarianism, and it's gone through so many iterations over the years. It's a very complex subject, but I just find it so inherently compelling.
Well, I think by nature we're consequentialists more than deontologists. It's hard to get people to adhere to rules consistently across the board. We do kind of calculate how other people respond in a consequential way. If I do this to you, I suspect you're going to not be happy about it, and you'll do that something to me that I'm not going to like. Therefore, I should not do, the sort of golden rule kind of calculation. Yeah. That's a kind of consequential. I mean, the golden rule sounds like a deontological principle, but in fact, it has consequentialism built into it. Because if you didn't do anything to me and I exploited you and you just let me exploit you, well, that would be a different world entirely.
Yeah, and it seems as if the biological world has that at its core. Why my chickens behave a certain way toward each other is because of the thing that happens after. And so it's built into basic animal behavior. It's no wonder it's also built into human behavior and human philosophy. So, I'm very concerned with human or animal behavior and what they're thinking, and they're not. The ontology doesn't really factor into it too much in that sense.
Yeah, the other thing I was thinking in that section of your book on, the word pleasure, at least on a human scale, or happiness, there's a lot of research on this. It's a huge industry, the positive psychology, the focus on happiness. There's 100 books on it and so on. But I think I'm not crazy about the word because it doesn't capture everything we care about and do. And it's not like we're walking around looking to be in a state of bliss all of the time. In fact, most of the time we're not. We're looking for challenges. A hard workout or a hard job, or the example I use is, kind of taking care of your elderly parents, which I did. It wasn't fun. I wasn't happy doing it. It didn't give me pleasure. There's a different word. It made my life meaningful, or it was a kind of more purposeful, right? Long-term goals, lead to a more purposeful, meaningful life. Whether you're happy or not is kind of beside the point. Short-term goals, like I want to, have a nice dinner with my family tonight, and we're going to go to this nice restaurant. That's short-term, and I do want to feel good. I'm going to have a beer or a glass of wine. That's kind of fun, makes me feel good. And I have some laughs with my buddies or whatever. That's short-term. Tomorrow, it's gone. It doesn't really matter. But at the moment, so happiness there, I can see that. Dan Gilbert at Harvard makes this big thing about how having children doesn't make parents happier. If you're doing it to be happy, you're doing it for the wrong reason. It's the most meaningful, purposeful thing you'll ever do. There's nothing even remotely close to anything else you'll do that can bring that kind of purposeful. The point is not to be blissfully happy with a smile on your face, changing diapers or whatever, right? It's really to make your life more meaningful. So I think it's important to keep those concepts separate.
Yeah, and this idea of constantly in a state of bliss is, first of all, impossible. So people are weird when they say, I just want to be happy. Well, what does that mean? It's not happy all the time. That's crazy. That doesn't make sense. But if you look at an animal like you and I, or any of my chickens, our daily routine is, you wake up and you feel tired, you feel like you have to pee, you're a bit hungry. Those aren't pleasurable feelings. Those are feelings that drive you to accomplish something. And that gives you a sort of satisfaction, which could be pleasure. But your whole day is up and down between negative and positive feelings that drive you to act. And so the idea that you're constantly happy all the time would mean that you didn't do anything. You would never even go pee because you're like, this is great. I don't need to pee. That doesn't make any sense. So all biology is driven by those fluctuations, I think. And so when we're talking about maximizing pleasure, it's just creating the fewest number of terrible dips, like that you're just absolutely miserable, and trying to maximize some pleasure. And you're right, like if you're taking care of your ailing parents or you're dealing with some sad, like you're not going to feel much pleasure at all, but you can do things that make you feel like you're doing the right thing, and you're helping the greatest number of people. So you're just avoiding too much negativity. And that in itself is the right thing to do according to your brain. So it's rewarding you. So that's how I think of, I agree with you. Constant happiness is an insane, bogus, like self-help book idea that we should reject. The least amount of pain during the day is the best we can hope for.
Yes, right. Reducing the depth of the dips.
Yeah.
So there, the negativity bias, we focus on negative things more than positive things because there are more ways for things to go wrong than to go right. If you have a good day today and your stock portfolio went up 6% and your family was well fed and you got through to tomorrow to get your kids off to school, those are just little tiny incremental things. But you get hit by a car tomorrow, it's over, right? So I mean,
Yep.
There's the kinds of things that could make things go bad quickly are almost infinite versus how many different ways things can go well, which are very finite. So our psychology is designed to focus on the negative for good reasons, right?
Absolutely.
So it's kind of hard to overcome that.
That's it. And I mean, I'm, as I was saying, joking before, kind of a miserable, anxious guy most of the time, but that drives me to try and create, to do things and that, I feel like a lot of people that I know who are very creative or do a lot of things are generally semi-miserable, misanthropic people. They're not like super bubbly because you're focused on the things that are wrong that you need to fix. Like, well, this isn't working. I got to do. And so you're constantly trying to come out of those dips to attain pleasure. And that drives so much of my behavior and most human behavior. I think a constantly bubbly person is a bizarre concept. And I don't think they're very effective people in general. Maybe a very bubbly person who gets a lot done, but I just feel like, maybe it would be great to be that way all the time. I don't know. But I'm happy enough being semi-miserable most of the time. It works for me.
You just don't want to be Nietzsche miserable because then you can't even get out of bed and function.
Yeah, and you don't want to be mean to the people around you. That's if your misery is making it hard for you to live or you're mean to your family members, that's no good at all. Then you definitely need to get some help. But if it's just like, I'm going to wake up in the morning and, have some problems to deal with. The world is a bad place. How do I make it better? Great. It's helpful.
Mm-hmm. Perfect place to end, Justin. Thank you for your book. I loved it. It was a great read. What's next on your research writing work agenda?
Yeah, well, I'm, I still do some work with the Dolphin Communication Project. So every once in a while, looking at dolphin stuff and teaching my class, hopefully on animal minds to people, and then maybe some more writing and thinking more about my own future, writing another book. Maybe that will be about people who think about the future. I'm not sure. So I'm just trying to maintain as much happiness throughout the day as I can. I don't know. So I'm going to get a coffee. That's what's going to happen next.
Keep your focus on prognostic myopia. There you go. I love that idea.
No, thanks so much. It was great speaking with you. This was a real honor for me. So
it was great speaking to you too. Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for saying that. I appreciate you coming on.